Um,
Yes, so please start again.
yes, just want to give you a report about my gratefulness, gratitude, or generosity practice.
Right. Uh-huh.
And I was giving out quarters this week, and I think it's an amazing experience because for such a small, as you said, token, people seem to be so thankful, and they just to have them smile. It's amazing to see that. So thank you for that.
Mm.
Now I feel like I should walk around with quarters with me all the time, like pockets full of quarters.
Yeah, very good, very good. So, you must be in an area where there are a lot of people who you could help that way.
Yes, definitely.
Uh, and that's in Brooklyn, right?
So I live in Brooklyn, but I work in Manhattan, so
Okay.
I cover both areas. um, yeah, thank you. And I want to remind you, I think next topic you wanted to cover was five aggregates.
Yes, okay. All right. Um, there, the five aggregates, um, is a way of looking at the body. And actually, the entire human being can be wrapped up in the aggregates. Um, in the sense that um, the aggregates are normally taught as an object of no self. When we can recognize that each one of the five aggregates is not me, then we can put those five aggregates in context of the Paticca Samuppada because they fit right in. The five aggregates, each one of them are actually individual items in the Paticca Samuppada. They're just arranged a little bit differently. But once we recognize that the body is not me, that the feelings are not me, that consciousness is not me, that perception is not me, and that all of my memory banks and all of the stuff that I have stored together in the past of this lifetime is still not me. That, in fact, it's a later on process. Once we understand how the five aggregates work together to create what they do, that's when we can begin to understand, well, where do I come from? Where is the source of this thing that everyone has it, we're born with it, it's deep in our DNA, and it's also deeply buried into our culture. So, this basic mistake that each human makes when they're born gets a complete verification and justification that that's true. Have you ever heard of Descartes?
I've heard you, but I'm not really familiar with them.
He's very famous for one particular statement. I think, therefore I
Oh,
am.
okay.
He was wrong. He would have been more correct if he had said, I think, therefore I think I am. Because that's really what's going on is that who we are winds up being an idea or a thought that's based upon basic instincts that we're born with right out of the DNA. All right, and that they've identified these instincts long ago, about 100 years or more ago. But now, with some research, I found that the Buddha already knew all about it and called them underlying tendencies. We also talk about them in Buddhism in the sense of the four modes of clinging. So the underlying tendencies and the four modes of clinging. Now, this is something really amazing. Because most in Western Buddhism, they talk about attachment and don't be attached to this, that, and the other thing. But I've got some really, really good news for you. And that is that these attachments or these clingings only have four types, only four modes. So we can begin to recognize that, oh, well, maybe the problem isn't so daunting after all, because there are 10,000 different things that I can attach and cling to, but only four modes of clinging cause suffering. These four modes of clinging are also the basic instincts, and I'll talk to you about how they fit in. But the number one and primary one of all of them we can see is what they call the self-preservation instinct. Now, the self-preservation instinct was done, they figured it out, but they didn't use Buddha language. They used whatever language that they knew, and so they called it a self-preservation instinct. Actually, that instinct isn't trying to preserve a self at all. It's an organism preservation instinct, or an organizational preservation instinct. Not trying to preserve a self, but that's in fact when humans make a primary mistake, they wind up having that organism preservation instinct turn into a self-preservation instinct. So you can say that self-preservation instinct is the organism's preservation instinct gone wrong due to ignorance. We're making a mistake. The other primary instincts um, fit on top of that one or support it. That the deepest instinct that we have is the preservation of the human body and keeping it alive. That's an instinctual kind of thing. That instinct can get really strong when someone is drowning. We will really, really fight to get back up to the surface so we can take a breath. That really is a very, very strong underlying tendency that we have, that when we don't understand it very well, can actually get us into a lot of trouble. And a clear example of that is being afraid of things that are not fearful. Why are we afraid of things? Is because we feel threatened. That self-preservation instinct is threatened, to where the organism itself is not under any threat at all. And so we make a huge mistake that way. All right. Another one, the other three, by the way, I'll list them off, is the procreation instinct, the nesting instinct, and the territorial instinct. These are the four primary basic instincts. And you can see that an example, for instance, of the nesting instinct, when it has gone really wrong, when it's really crazy, it winds up being what they call the Oedipus complex. An example of that is Donald Trump. He could be very happy in a hovel, but he wants a big tower. So we are making the basic mistake is, am I my house? And a lot of people, especially when they start to get a lot of money, they start making that huge mistake. They want a bigger and bigger house, because that gives them the idea that I'm a bigger and bigger person, or I'm more and more important, etc., like that. So that's an example of that. And that the way that I look at the procreation instinct is not merely sexuality. In fact, I want to turn that on its head for you so that you can understand it a little bit better. And that is that the procreation instinct, if you look at the word procreation, it actually means to manufacture or to produce. And that you can see that in very, very early man, that we started using tools. Those tools eventually, probably within a very short period of time, became weapons. And to now, just take a look around at your room. And you can see that procreation instinct is all over the place. It's in the furniture. It's in the walls. It's in everything that we use to protect ourselves. Um, One of the examples that I've used is a cartoon that I saw many years ago, and I see it on a regular occasion. You've probably seen the cartoon, and what it is a cartoon of a Neanderthal, heavy-built dude in a bearskin rug with a huge club in his right hand. He's got his back to us, and in his left hand is a handful of hair, and he's dragging a woman into the cave. Have you ever seen that
No.
cartoon? Okay, so now that image is not an image of sexuality at all. It's an image of power. The number one item in that entire cartoon is that club he's got in his hand. That's the procreation. All right, not just necessarily sexuality. Sexuality is a different kind of urge, but the ability to gather material objects around us to make our lives easier and to make it protection, that's the procreation instinct. And you can see how we collect other people, perhaps a spouse, in that way. All right, that's so a spouse is completely different than a sex object, but the spouse is part of the procreation instinct, much more deeply buried than merely sexuality. And yet, because I think it's because Christianity is so hung up on sex that when they understand the teachings of the Buddha, they almost always put sexuality into it. Now, how that's translated into English is normally sensual desire, but it's desire of the senses for desiring any and everything that would be in the service of protecting oneself. The same thing is true, by the way, with the nesting instinct. And the nesting instinct basically means that there are basically two kinds of animals in the world. There are the kinds of animals that are abandoned upon their birth. And then there's the kind of animals which are normally higher, are having some sort of care. For instance, birds have a nest and they care for their young, but turtles merely bury their eggs and go back to sea, letting the baby turtle. So that nesting instinct is something that's in a higher part of the mind. But we can see that birds and many kinds of reptiles, insects, no. But some snakes, in fact, have nests, and they do take care of their young. So the idea of coming and staying in a nest is for mutual self-protection at night. Things get more dangerous at night than they are in the daytime. And so um, humans learned to nest before we were humans, long before we were humans. In fact, if you look at where language comes from, you can see that the nesting instinct far, far predates that. We can put language at about 40 million years back. But the nesting instinct goes all the way back to the wallabies, all the way back to the lions. We don't. The dogs do it. Wolves do it. They get a den, and they all sleep together. And that one of the qualities of the nest, both with primates, the troop of primates or the wolves that are collected into a clan, they sleep together, they have a nest together, and there's generally something evolves as a nest manager, which is generally the alpha male. Now, the alpha male in a wolf pack defines the rules. He makes the rules. So our whole rule system is based upon the nesting instinct. How do we get along together in a nest that we come together in every day for mutual self-protection? If you take that and explode it times 7 billion, you wind up with human society. That the whole planet Earth is nothing but a nest with a huge number of nest rules. Okay? Do you belong in our nest or not? That's the passport. Isn't that amazing? That it's all instinctual, that the entire human society comes out of the nesting instinct, which means also all of our rites, rules, rituals, ceremonies, ways to do things, and everything like that that has come up through society is based in this instinct. So when you start to become free from the ignorance of the instinct, we stop looking at things from the sense of rules. The first thing that we recognize is that no one's going to become enlightened, or let us not use that word. Let's instead use the word free from suffering. No one is ever going to be free from suffering by following rules. And yet, our whole Western society is built upon that mentality that's very deep into the society, possibly again coming from Christianity, because Christianity is set up, oh, if you do follow our rules, then you will get saved. If you do our ceremonies, if you take Jesus as the Savior, or as the Baptists do, if you go take a bath in dirty water with your clothes on and then vote for Donald Trump, thou shalt be saved. It's kind of a joke. But you get the idea that, and so we recognize now that, oh, to become free from suffering means that we have to start inspecting a lot of these rules, because a lot of the rules and rituals and ceremonies and laws and all of this stuff, including enforcement, judgment, prison, the whole court system, everything is built upon this nesting instinct of getting the rules right. And look how much suffering this rule system creates. Many of the people who are in prison don't really need to be in prison, but the whole system is that way. Now, someone would say, oh, well, if you take all of that away, then you will have nothing but chaos. And that people will go around drive-by shootings and killings, and the whole country will be like it is in downtown, whatever, LA or wherever the worst of it is. Well, what that indicates is that there is absolutely no rule of law. Then that is wrong view. Everybody gets hurt. No one wins. War, pestilence, etc. But when we have a set of rules, then we can build a society, and so you could see that as right view. Unfortunately, it's not right enough view because it doesn't fully eliminate suffering. There is still suffering when we have ordinary right view. Now, parts of ordinary right view is the idea of, if we're going to control the people, it's easier or better to get them to control themselves than it is to control them directly. The easy example is that in the old days, they would have people enslaved to build something. Okay, to pick cotton or to build a pyramid or whatever like that. Though there's evidence now that there was no slavery, they had something else, and I'll get to that, to build the pyramid. But the whole idea of slavery is that you can force someone to do that stuff with a stick. You can beat them. You can put on a ball and chain and other things like that. That's how they control people so that they can get them to work. Nowadays, we use the carrot. We use the paycheck. But it's the same thing. It's the masters of the universe, or whoever is in charge. And in fact, if you think about it correctly, you realize that it's the system that's broken rather than an individual or a small group of people who are causing the suffering for all of humanity. Because even the ones who were, let us say, instigating and or keeping the system going, they're suffering too. No one is free from suffering. Isn't that amazing? No one is free from suffering. And that we have been using rules, laws, rituals, nesting instinct, etc., stuff like that, to try to make things better, and we have not been successful at it at all. And then, in fact, one of the things that you can see, and this happens mostly on Wall Street, but it actually happens everywhere, and that is that some legislative body will pass a new law. And while it's being passed, it's being discussed, and all of the other people who don't want that law are already figuring out ways around it. We call them loopholes. Sometimes the loopholes are built in so that some people can get through and others don't. But the whole idea is about the laws, the rules, the rituals, the ceremonies, etc. We have been given the idea that they're useful, they're safe, they have some value, when in fact, when we start inspecting them with the Dhamma eye, we recognize, oh no, there's a better way of looking at it than this way. And that better way of looking at it is through the lens of suffering and no suffering. If we start looking at our whole life that way, of what is suffering and what is no suffering, then we don't need 10,000 laws or 10,000 rules. We can see exactly what needs to be done right here, right now. And so a lot of people will say, well, that means that I can discard the old and only apply the new. Yes, but if you apply the new correctly, then it works. If you don't apply it correctly, then the old system is going to get in trouble. An example of that is the policeman stops you. It's not a good idea to tell the policeman, oh, that's a nice blue suit you've got on there, but I don't think you really have any authority on me at all. In fact, I think you're out here doing a sting operation and that you're the criminal and I'm the good guy. Now, that actually, in a higher wisdom position, is true, but you don't say that to the policeman because you're going to cause him and therefore you a lot of suffering by saying that. So by looking at it from the position of suffering and no suffering, we wind up getting along in the world of rules without having to directly try to keep any of them, because we've got a higher rule, a better rule. So when we talk about the four modes of clinging, one of the four modes of clinging is when humans misapply the nesting instinct so that it becomes the rules of the house rather than merely the house. And I can give you many thousands of examples. One would be the 14-year-old girl who wants to go out, and Daddy says, you cannot go out tonight because this is a school night. And she says, yes, I am going out. And he says, if you're going to live in this house, you have to do it my way, right? That is the direct example of confusing the house with house rules. And that the house rules are made not in the service of the entire community, but the rules are made in the name or in the service of the guy who made the rules, which gives rise to the quality of the golden rule. Now, you'd probably have heard that there's a golden rule from Christianity, but I tell you, there are three golden rules, and I want to go through all three of them now in this nesting instinct, because we're talking about rules. Jesus had a golden rule, and his golden rule was actually golden in the sense of wisdom. To treat others the way that we want to be treated. Now, that's actually got a whole lot of ignorance built into it. To have more wisdom would be to treat people the way they want to be treated, which is the Buddhist way. But in Christianity, as they say, treat people the way you want to be treated. Well, that winds up with the husband giving his wife E-span and panties for Christmas, and she gives her husband a blender and a knife set or something, stuff that she wants. She gives to the husband, and he gives her things that he wants. That's not exactly the right way of doing it. The better way is to give people things that they actually do want. So this is the golden rule, giving people things that they want. But I'm going to go a little bit deeper into psychology now, in the sense that there is another kind of golden rule, and that is, um, he who has all the gold makes the rules. Now, that's actually a kind of a later thing, in the sense that you can see that the Catholic Church has got all of this money because they've gotten it all, and that they've accumulated it all, and that now that they've got the wealth, or now that an example also would be a police force. If that police force is well funded, then they go around making the rules. If the police force is not well funded, then they don't make so many rules. So he who's got the gold makes the rules. But that's also kind of late. A more primitive way of looking at it is he who makes the rules gets the gold. And here is where we're really looking at it. He who makes the rules is almost always going to make rules to benefit himself rather than benefiting the entire group. So if you as an individual stop with that idea and start looking at that the only real rule there is suffering and no suffering, then that becomes completely egalitarian. And it does not have the quality of shifting wealth from one place to another. But normally the rule systems that are throughout the world are rule systems that are set up to benefit the people who already have money so that they can get more of it. That's just the way that the rule systems work. They worked that way with the Catholic Church. That's how the Catholic Church got so wealthy. It's because they were making the rules. And now that they've got the money, now they can continue to make the rules so that they can continue to be wealthy. And it's not just the Catholic Church. Every government is that way, each one of them. So this is the nesting instinct. The way that we want to look at the territorial instinct is that this, for example, dogs. My dogs here, they're still very territorial, and I like that. They don't quite know where the outer boundaries are, but they do know the difference between someone coming and someone who's just out there. Well, the humans, we have made a different kind of shift. We've made a mistake. You see, the dogs are much more natural to actually guard their territory because they know what the territory is. With humans, especially because of our mobility, we have diverted our territorial instinct into intellectual territory. That the groups and things that we belong to mentally. And so we have views and beliefs. An example is that the U.S. is better than China. Or another example is China is better than the U.S., and we haven't even decided what this word better actually means. But the idea is that this is my territory, and because America is my territory is better than their territory. So it's attachments. Okay, and so the territorial mentality that we have winds up being basically the identity of who we are is based upon what we identify with. And we identify with objects, and we identify with NGOs, we identify with organizations, etc., like that, and almost always you can understand it from the position of a flag, or a symbol, or an icon, or an avatar. Examples of that would be a crucifix, or even a cross. And you can see how much that cross has built into it. It's got an entire ideology. It's just an icon, And so that's part of the territory. So if you identify with that cross, you're also identifying with the entire territory that comes with that cross. The cross is just an icon. But we can do that with anything. We can do it with a red, white, and blue elephant, or a red, white, and blue jackass. Sorry, donkey. Or we can do it with the American flag or the British flag. And so these flags are symbols. And any time that we identify with an organization or something that has a symbol, then whenever that symbol or the other people who are associated with that symbol have the ups and downs of the vagaries of elections and whatnot like that, if you identify with that group, you're going to suffer too, right along with them. So, for instance, if you're a Democrat and two things happen and one of them is a good thing and the other thing is a bad thing, let's say that happens to Donald Trump. And when something good happens, we feel bad. And when something bad happens, we feel good. Well, I'll tell you, your feelings have nothing to do with Donald Trump. You do not have to have any feelings about him at all other than the feelings you want to have. But if you identify as a Democrat or if you identify as a Republican, then the ups and downs of the Democrat or the ups and downs of the Republican Party are going to mean that you have ups and downs also. You are subject to suffering just like they do. So another example would be an election. The Americans just had a past election in November, right? Was there anyone who was over the moon completely satisfied with what happened? Nobody. Was there anybody who was completely and totally dejected? Maybe quite a few. But the reality is that there were some winners, some losers. The Democrats won some, they lost some, etc., like that. And yet, you do not find anyone who is completely satisfied. Everyone was dissatisfied with that election. Everyone, except those who didn't care. Those who didn't care don't get dissatisfied with the results. So this is how we need to start looking at what is my territory. Because that territory can be dangerous. Maybe I should not be identifying with all of these banners, all of these flags, all of these organizations, because any organization I belong to is going to hurt. And when it does, if I identify with it, I'll choose to hurt along with it. So this is attachment to rights, to views, especially views that have identity to them. So if you anything that you can join is going to cause you suffering. If you join a church, you'll get suffering from that church. If you join a motorcycle gang, you will gain suffering from that motorcycle gang. If you join a meditation group, you will also get some suffering from that meditation group. That's just the way things are when we identify with things that actually are not me. So now we've had all four of these instincts, but we've also seen them as four modes of clinging, and we can also see them as the four liberations. Isn't that amazing? Buddhism is that simple. The four basic instincts that humans have are actually the same thing as the four modes of clinging, and it is only four modes of clinging that we need to deal with. And also, when we stop clinging with them, then these are the four freedoms. Now, I'll go over the four freedoms very quickly with you, but we'll go back. One of them is to no longer have a banner. Another one is to fill the moat or fill the trench. Another one is to no longer carry the bow or the crossbow. In other words, we're defenseless, we're unarmed, we do not have a protective moat, we no longer have a flag out, I don't know about New York, but I do know in general Middle America that you can go down the street in your car and you will see people who still have an American flag right outside their house. All right, which means that's a symbol that the people in that house suffer over that flag. Sure, some things happen good, but when something happens bad, they feel bad. All right. The fourth one, which is the deepest one, is to unbar the door. Now, when we look at these things, we talk about a door. Oh, well, the door must mean the nesting instinct, but in fact, no. The nesting instinct is more of the filling in of the trench, of not having the place guarded. That we, in fact, look at the barring of the door as the inner core, our heart, and that when people are hurting or subject to hurt or suffering in any way, then we feel afraid and we want protection. So we slam the heart door closed and lock it. But when we are free from suffering and we are free from the dangers of suffering, then we become enormously open hearted. We don't lock things away anymore. We don't identify with organizations. We don't look for ways of protection, and we certainly do not need any weapons. So these are, in fact, the four modes of clinging, and you can see that the Buddha had it set like that to where when you stop identifying and when you stop trying to protect, when you're free from suffering, you can actually open your heart. Now, in the West, they have the thing all backwards. Oh, if you would open your heart, then everything would be okay. No, if you just open your heart, you're going to get hurt. We have to find a way of getting the protection so that we don't hurt, and then we can open our heart freely. Because people feel afraid, they don't want to have an absolute open heart. So, in fact, the 1/4 at a time, the generosity is partly the way that you're opening your heart. And by doing so, you are not finding danger. But before you started getting quarters, you would feel less comfortable, almost a little in fear of these people. But now that you're making a connection with them, there's nothing to fear. In fact, this is part of the opening of the heart, is with this generosity. So now we've looked at these four modes of clinging, which are also the four basic instincts, which are also the four kinds of liberation. These four basic instincts, or excuse me, these four basic modes of clinging are the I've lost my train of thought. Excuse me. The four modes of clinging. Oh, here's where I'm going. Means that there are other things that we can cling to that are worthwhile clinging to. That it's wise to not cling to some things, the instinctual things, the old way of doing it. But in fact, we do want to cling to some new things. A way of clinging would be determination. So becoming determined to become free from suffering in this moment. I'm not going to do that. Okay. That's actually a kind of an attachment, but it's a very wholesome, beneficial attachment. So let me give you a few things that are worthy of attachment to so that you won't get confused about these Buddhists who say don't attach to anything. All right. One thing that's worth attaching to is this present moment. To be here now. To be in the present moment as much as you can, to attach yourself to that. That's one thing that's very wholesome to attach to. Another thing that's worth attaching to is the Four Noble Truths, the teaching of the Buddha. To start seeing the Four Noble Truths in everything, to start seeing Dhamma everywhere. This is something that's really worthy of attachment to. Another one would be, just the idea of happiness. Begin to attach your ideas to happiness, to good cheer. So these are things that are really worthy of attaching to. And these four modes of clinging that I have introduced to you are things that happen in the mind that are based upon feeling. Now, generally what happens is that if I feel, I normally feel only one of three ways. I can either say I like it, or I can say I don't like it, or I can say I'm not sure whether I like it or not. These are basic feelings. These are the feelings when the Buddha talks about vedana, he's talking about these three kinds. And I'll introduce automatically a fourth kind, and that is a wise feeling, because almost always the feeling of I want it is an ignorant feeling. We're not even sure of it. It happens really fast, as the mind is so fast. And so something will affect us, and then we'll have a feeling about it, and the feelings will almost always, because of ignorance, fall into the instinctual level. All right, for instance, if I like it, the instinctual thing is I want it. A deeper instinct is I've got to have it. Now I'm clinging to it. I got to have it. All right, these are now already into the four modes of clinging. So feelings cause the clinging. In the Pali, it's vedana, upadana, tanha. Now, if you want to own something, there's a quality of ownership. And the quality of ownership is that there is an owner somehow in there. Without an owner, ownership is really hard. So if I want to own something, there's got to be a me that owns it. If I'm not trying to own anything, then there's no need for a me. Think about that for a second. So, in fact, it's my physical environment, it's my materialism, it's my attachment to rites, rules, and rituals, it's my attachment to my views. And when I attach to those things, they cause suffering because I cannot keep everybody having the same view that I have. In fact, when I attach to something, one of the things that we talk about in Buddhism is anicca. Everything changes. So if you like something and you attach to it and you hold to it and cling to it, you're going to lose it. You're going to feel bad. So it has to do with, the ownership has to do with how attached or how much clinging we have. So what we're beginning to recognize is that it's the feeling of these five aggregates, it's the feelings that eventually lead to suffering. But the feelings themselves are not you. You are not the feelings. The easiest way to see that is that right now you cannot feel the way you want to feel. If feelings were really you, then you would feel the way you want to feel. But you can't. You feel the way that you're in the habit of feeling instead. I like that nice smile. All right, here's an example of that. The lottery, or Ed McMahon, who comes to give the prize winner a huge check of $10 million. Okay, if someone was to give you $10 million, think about it for a second. And there comes the smile. All right, now the thought of $10 million brings a smile, but an actual $10 million is going to bring brand new neighbors, brand new relatives, people who want to loan you money, or people who want to borrow money. There's going to be people who want to sell you things, and your whole life is going to get really screwed up with that $10 million. But thinking about it brings a smile, which means that at some level you are actually in control of your feelings, that they can be controlled indirectly until we begin to understand what they are. But most people say, oh, I would like to have the $10 million, then I'll be happy, without thinking through. In fact, the statistics show that almost everyone, after they won the lottery, after 3 years, they're worse off than they were before. And so the lottery started giving it out once a little bit every year for 20 years rather than giving it all at once, because all at once just creates enormous suffering. People do not know how to handle that kind of money. But the idea of getting the money means that if that can make you happy, just the thought, oh yeah, wouldn't it be nice if, okay, well, wouldn't it be nice if I knew how to control my mind so that I could be happy without the $10 million? I don't need it. And in fact, the real 10 million is going to be a lot of trouble. So now that you're beginning to understand that while we do not normally control our feelings and that the feelings are not me, there are some things we can do to manage feelings. And we talk about that from the position of wisdom. That if we know how we feel, then we can do something about it right then and there. If we don't know how we feel, then we're going to start making mistakes. So here's an example of from the other one. The 14-year-old boy is standing in the hall at school, and he sees the bully and his two buddies come around the corner. And he immediately tenses up. He becomes afraid. All right. But the reality of the situation is, even though he's scared to death of this bully, the likelihood of him dying right on the spot is very low. And so you can see that this child is full of ignorance. This 14-year-old boy he's not even being confronted by the bully yet. He just sees the bully, and he begins to get unhappy and upset. If the bully sees him and recognizes what a state he's in, then the bully is going to go bully him. But if he walks down the hall like he's the champion, and you see that also in many cases, especially with dogs. If someone comes to the house as if they have been here before and they know what they're doing and they're looking for something, the dogs are not going to bother them much. But if someone comes trepidation, they don't know the dogs are going to start barking and barking and barking because they know this person doesn't belong here, and they picked that up all off of body behavior, and they did it instinctually. And so when we show fear, the bully is going to pick on that. If that 14-year-old boy had said, that bully is not going to bother me today, I'm going to just do my thing, then he's probably going to have a whole lot less trouble with the bully. So it's our ignorant feelings that get in the big trouble. And I'll go back to feelings in a little bit, but I want you to understand that there are 4 kinds of feelings. One of them is safe, the wise feeling. If you like something and are ignorant to that feeling, you'll want that. There's also a big mistake that we can make, and that is that if I like it, it must be good. And if I don't like it, it must be bad. And if I don't know what it is, that third kind of feeling, if I don't know what it is, then it must be bad because it's dangerous to assume that it's safe when I'm, in fact, not sure if it's safe or not. And so we put a lot of ignorant behavior and reaction into ignorant feelings. But if you know how you feel, then you can change, for instance, that feeling of not knowing, which is related with doubt, insecurity, uncertainty. But with wisdom and joy, we can change that into curiosity, into inspection, into investigation. That's the way we start working with feelings. But if we do not work with them correctly so that they stay ignorant, then I don't like it becomes I got to get rid of it, becomes, oh, it's bad, it's evil, let's start passing some laws against it. Where in fact it's just a feeling. I don't like it. I'm heterosexual and I find a gay guy, I'm afraid of him. I don't know what he's doing. I don't like it. Therefore, let's have some laws and rules against gay people. Let's kill them. All right? And you can see how ignorant that mentality is. But if the guy can say, oh, I do not understand gays, I don't know what they are, let me go investigate, then more than likely he's going to have a new friend on his hands rather than a dead body on his hands. And it's all about feelings. So we have now come to one of them, of the five aggregates. Sorry it took me so long, but I want to get down to the point that you understand that how you feel and what you feel is not you. Because our feelings are normally ignorant, we don't have any control over them. So part of what your meditation practice is going to be is for you to start understanding what your feelings are, how to catch them, how to see them, so you can begin to deal with them directly. All right, so the same thing is true about the body, to the point that the body is actually fairly easy to deal with. Jesus knew this. In fact, he said at one point that you are not the body because you cannot change the stature. But going a little bit more into sci-fi, you're not a changeling. You cannot become what you want to become. And look at how many industries, an entire industry is based upon trying to fulfill that ignorant, stupid desire that people have to be different in their body than they actually are. I'm not handsome enough, so I'll buy some clothes. I'm not handsome enough, so I'm going to lose some weight. The girl says, I'm not handsome enough, I'm going to change shades of lipstick. So we've wound up with a cosmetic industry, a clothing industry, a sports industry, a workout industry, a medical industry, and it goes on and on and on because people make the basic mistake, I am the body, when in fact they are not the body. You cannot be whatever age you want to be. But look how many people want to be a different age than they are. Young children want to be a little older. I never saw a 6-year-old who wanted to be 95, but you do see 6-year-olds who want to be 7. They want it because they'll say 6.5. All right. When they're 14 or 15, they want to be old enough to do what, like vote or drink or whatever like that. So we wind up as an entire civilization of human beings lying about our age. No one wants to be the age that they are. The old people want to be young. The young people want to be middle-aged. The middle-aged people want to be young again, etc., and no one wants to be old. But everybody gets old. And that proves that the body is uncontrollable. Therefore, no one who is a self, you can see that there's an instinct in there, the self-preservation instinct. But when that instinct is measured against the body, we think that we are the body, and who I am is the body. And there's a lot of industries that really promote that, mostly the entertainment industry or maybe the runway industry or whatever like that. And the young women who get into that, they get completely confused because their entire identity, their income, and all of their social friends are all based upon I am the body. And so as they grow old, they grow extraordinarily miserable because they can't control the body. And it gets old. And when it gets old, it loses its runway abilities. So this is hard for us to understand. So I'm introducing this, and I'm introducing it in a kind of a strange way for you to understand. First off, feelings are not you, and that it's our feelings that lead to all the problems, all the clinging and suffering in the world. But that we do that many times because we identify, I am the body. So now that you know, or at least you've intellectually come to understand, you are not the body. That's not who you are. That you're not the feelings. That's not who you are. I don't think that many people confuse feelings with who I am. so much as identification with the body, but some professions do. Actors, um, musicians sometimes will identify with feeling because the trade that they have is based in feeling. Music has a lot of emotional kind of stuff. For instance, a military march is not a waltz. Some music you want to dance to, and other music you want to cry to. So that shows that music has that feeling quality built into it. So people who get really identified with music often will identify themselves. I am my feelings. But you can see how it's built into the language. Oh, I feel good today. No, there's no me there. There's just good feeling. But we make that basic mistake is I feel. I feel good. I feel bad. I feel angry. Actually, people don't like to be angry, and so or they let us say the injunction is there. I'm not supposed to be angry, so they'll say I'm not angry. All right. So the next ones that we have to deal with now that we've covered body and feeling and how feeling actually does lead to suffering and does lead to the creation of the self. One of the big ones that we have to look at now, the third one on the list, is consciousness. Now, consciousness, um, let us say that most religions will strongly identify that I am my consciousness. When Christians have the idea of going to heaven, they generally don't see this body as going to heaven. But what they do understand is there's some sort of ephemeral or ghost-like body that has not realized, but still has the ability of real eyes. Doesn't quite have real ears, but it has all the capabilities of real ears, and in a sense, they have the senses of consciousness without the associated reality of an eye that gives them eye consciousness. So, um, in old ancient Hinduism, and we still see it there, they will actually have formal statements like consciousness is that which runs in circles from life to life, um, experiencing the results of good and bad past karma. I think I've got that memorized right. All right. And so you can see what they're talking about is that consciousness is that which can be reborn. And the Buddha was very, very specific to point this out. And in fact, this is what I'm about to talk to you now has had major impact upon all the religions of the world. But what the Buddha came to understand was is that consciousness is dependently arising. That consciousness depends upon something. That if you have those requisites there, then consciousness can exist, and without those requisites, there is no consciousness. Now, that whole point that I just made flies directly into the face of reincarnation or rebirthing kind of ideas, Christianity, that when the person dies, his consciousness goes to heaven or hell, or the Hindu, when the body dies, that consciousness will run from this world to the next, etc., like that. But the Buddha was very clear to point out that consciousness is not something that rambles on all by itself. That any time that there is consciousness, there are dependent things that have to coalesce together in order for consciousness to arise. A clear example of that is when you are fast asleep at night, not all of those things are there, and therefore you are not conscious. But someone can come into the room making a whole lot of sensual things, sensual in the sense of banging a drum, playing a trumpet, throwing cold water on your body, etc., like that. And so finally the senses will get down into it, into the consciousness. And when it does, that's what we mean by waking up. But we also recognize that just as you're sitting here with me, that your consciousness will move from one thing to another to another. That at one point you're looking at the screen, and in another moment you're listening to what I am saying, but you can't do both exactly at the same time. So you move your consciousness back and forth. So eye consciousness is the ability to see. And eye consciousness comes from the object plus the eye. If there is no eye there, then the object doesn't cause seeing. If the eye is not there and the object is there, it's just the object. If the eye is there but not functioning properly, perhaps it's closed or whatever, that's the same thing. But with the eye is there, but there's no light or there's no tree, then there's no tree consciousness. All right. Now, one point that I'd like to make to you is that there are, in fact, two different kind of consciousnesses, and that these two different kind of consciousness existed both in the Pali language and in the English language. All right. One is an internal, and the other one is an external consciousness. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. I see a tree. I see what you're saying. I see a tree is completely different than I see what you're saying, because I see what you're saying required some processing. Or even if I just say I see, it's normally that way. But let's go back to the tree. I see the tree means that when I saw something out there, I had to process it. And by processing it, that was called perception, and the result of my processing was tree. In that regard, I see a tree is exactly the same kind of seeing as I see what you mean, but it's later. All right. What we can call that would be realization. And we use that word a lot. You probably heard that word. You probably used it 1,000 times. Oh, I realize what, I see what you're saying, or I realize it. But guess what? We cannot realize anything. We cannot realize that tree. If I were going to realize that tree, that means I've got a tree growing right out of my brain. big, I can't realize it. What I can do is I can mentalize that tree. I can mentalize it in the sense that I can grasp an idea of the tree. That's an important quality, to say I can grasp the idea of the tree. But there is also another kind of consciousness, which is a bare consciousness that's based on just merely sight. When there is merely the sight, or when the sound is merely the sound, it's not hearing yet. So this is the kind of consciousness that we want to look at. And that consciousness there too, that consciousness which can experience, without processing, experience sensual input. Sensual input, when someone is dead or fast asleep or on or drunk or whatever like that, the sensual input doesn't get registered as consciousness. But when we are alert, awake, etc., when I can, then that kind of consciousness. Now, the Buddha also said that consciousness is very much like a fire, and that the way that we talk about fire is because of the fuel of that fire. An example would be a log fire, a grass fire, a house fire, a car fire, a gas fire, a cow dung fire. All right? When we talk about fires this way, we talk about what the fuel was. In consciousness, we talk about it the same way. We talk about it, what's the fuel? So it's eye consciousness, it's ear consciousness, it's body or sensational consciousness, it's touch consciousness, or it's deep touching, which is called proprioceptic in the body. All right, so there are these various different kinds of consciousness that arise from the various senses. The next thing that happens, if anything else happens, because if someone is really, really sharp, then they can leave the consciousness at merely consciousness, in the sense of seeing is merely the seeing, it's not necessarily processing it. This actually comes quite useful to understand about meditation, especially, you probably heard the name Mahasi. Mahasi Sayadaw, they have the idea of noting, and they talk about rising, falling, touching, sitting. Well, rising, falling is nothing but the rising, falling of the breath. The touching is nothing but what the body is doing while it's sitting there, and the sitting is actually the proprioceptic system. So it's in fact it's body and breathing. It's the rising, falling, touching, sitting. But they also talk about noting beyond the rising, falling, touching, sitting. And what Westerners make a mistake doing is they make the mistake of fully noting, as if they were taking their notepad out and writing a note to themselves. That's far too much noting. And that's where they make a mistake, because by doing all of that noting, we're missing out on a lot of sensory input that we should note and then let it pass. Note it well and let it pass means we don't process it much. We don't think about it. We just, and so an example of that then could be used, instead of the word noting, I use the word witness, because it's clearly there are two different kinds of witnesses. There is the witness who saw it, and then there is the witness who goes and sits on the stand and tells a story about what he saw. Okay? Those are the two witnesses kind. Now, normally you would expect that when you get the second kind of witness, that's because he was also originally the first kind of witness. But in meditation, we don't even want the second kind of witness. We don't want to tell ourselves stories about what's going on. We just want to continue to keep things going on as we see them by themselves. So another word that we could use to guard this danger is the word labeling, because labeling is up there with noting. All right, so when I say I see the tree, I'm actually labeling that tree in my mind. I've already processed it. I've gone through a set of processing that changed the actual visual image into a thought of tree. So consciousness is dependently arisen based upon the outside contact, but so it starts up when the eye sees something, but immediately or very, very quickly, certainly within a half a second or so, we start processing that to try to figure it out. Now, what I mean by processing that is that the word tree, in your memory systems, you have images of many different kinds of trees: fir tree, fan palms, date palms, oil palms, oak trees, all kinds of different trees. And so when we label something as a tree, we've got to go find that, is there anything in my memory system that matches this well enough that I can label it what I labeled those things as tree. All right, that whole process requires two things. It requires, number one, a memory, and number two, it requires a processing mechanism that can take that original consciousness data and process it through our own internal database so that we can come up with an internal consciousness. Like, I see what you're saying. I understand what you're doing. And it's that internal representation that contacts us. It's that internal representation that causes feeling. It's not the tree itself that caused that. It was the internal tree. So the example is, and most of my students are guys, so I'll give you the example I give them, is that they go into 7-Eleven and there's a pretty girl behind the counter. And then they go out to the car and they get in their car and they're thinking about this girl with thoughts like, I should go back and introduce myself. Or I wonder what this and that and the other thing. Basically, though, what they're beginning to enjoy, and in fact this girl that they're falling in love with is not the girl that's in the 7-Eleven, it's the girl in their mind. And the girl in 7-Eleven is a real girl with real problems, a real family, perhaps 2 ex-husbands, 2 kids, and a mother who hates every man who comes to talk to that girl. That's why she's got 2 ex-husbands, is because of her mom. Well, you see, the guy who's falling in love with this girl as he's driving away, he doesn't have any of that information. All he's got is his feelings. I like what I saw. That's why we cause ourselves so much misery, is because we confuse what is inside the mind with what's outside the mind. The outside mind girl is a real girl with real problems in all kinds of situations, but the girl inside the boy's mind is wonderful. She's even more beautiful than she was when she was in the store. And this is what we do with our mental imagery. And so it's that mental image that he has in his mind that is contacting him, giving him now very pleasant feelings that go to, I like her, I want her, now I've got to have her. And so he is full blown into puppy love, or what they call love sickness. All of those kinds of things happen by what happens just inside the mind. That so what we have to understand is that the 5 aggregates of body, feeling, consciousness, perception, and our memory banks are not me. That in fact, let's look at those memory banks for a second. The memory banks that we have, the Buddha has basically 3 of them. There are, and the word that he uses is sankara. There are bodily sankaras. There are, let us call them verbal sankaras, because the Buddha does. And what we mean by that is intellectual things like memories. And then we have another kind of sankara, which is actually, it's mental, but in the Thai language translations of the Pali have this as heart, and is talking about emotion. That in fact we have stored memories of emotions, and the way that we have stored our emotions and what we stored as emotions are the memory bank that we draw on, so we're going to draw out and repeat old emotions, because that's how we process with our old memory banks. All right. So we have bodily sankara, and the way that you can see how bodily sankara is that, okay, one person is a jazz musician, another one is a concert pianist, another one is a drummer, another one is a Heisman Trophy winner, another one has just run Wimbledon. All right. How can these people do that? Is because they have stored memories in their body. It is actually quite possible for a musician who has a repertoire of, say, maybe 100 songs to take a job in a bar, become a piano bar player, and then the same pretty girl that he met in the 7-Eleven now comes up and stands with him at the piano. and his fingers and his body are capable of continuing to play that music while he has a conversation with her. That's just amazing. I've been a musician enough to know that, yeah, that stuff is stored right into the body. How to play a musical instrument, how to catch a football, how to throw a fly line, all of those things are actually stored right there down into the body. If that's true, then what we're actually saying is that the mind itself is not just in the brain. The mind itself is actually all over the body because the learning is there. How can a dead hand learn how to play the piano? It can't. It's got to be alive, and that means it's got neurons, which means it's got storage. All kinds of things get stored into the body. The second kind of storage requires language. It's the way that the word the Buddha used was verbal, and in fact, do you know any Latin at all?
Just some phrases.
Okay, do you play the organ, the kind of organs that they had in churches years ago?
Do I play it?
Yes. No.
No.
Okay. There is on the organ a particular stop that they can draw, and the name of it is vox humana. And what vox humana is actually the word vox is a Latin word, and it means voice. In fact, our word voice comes from the Latin word vox. Well, guess what? That word vox is exactly the same Pali word we're talking about. Okay, it's the vocal or the human voice, but we use the word voice when we're actually with Buddhism looking deep into where and how the voice is used. We use it for conveying of ideas. We can paint pictures with the voice. It's our language. So we store things. We store an entire language. In France, they store the French language. In America, they store, I don't know what, something close to English. So we store these languages in the mind in a way so that they can be drawn out in order to understand the world. Now, we don't have to understand. Here's, by the way, an example. On YouTube, there are a lot of Saturday Night Live skits. One of the Saturday Night Live skits actually was a series that they took over a long period of time. It wasn't just they did it all right now, but they took a little clip of this person and a little clip of that person. And basically what they were doing with these people was that while they were interviewing them, they would throw a large, empty plastic fish about this big right at the person just to get their reaction. Surprisingly enough, the very first people they had was women, and all of the women kept getting hit right in the face with this big plastic fish. And then they had a Heisman Trophy winner, and they didn't throw it at him directly at him while he was talking. They threw it from the periphery, from the side, while he was talking, and he grabbed that thing right out of the air. He only was able to do that because he had those sankaras built right into the body. He knew how to look out of the corner of his eye. He saw movement. He was able to grab that thing without hardly even, in fact, what interrupted his conversation was not the fish. It was everybody's reaction to the fact that he could catch it right out of the air with it coming from a very acute angle. So these are the things that the human body are capable of, but it's almost remarkable as to how much intellectual data that we can store, how much the human body is capable of. But when we look at it from that perspective, then we recognize, oh, well, how dangerous it is that we've stored so much emotion. How to feel is stored, so that the same event happens over and over again. We feel the same way over and over again. And we use that, by the way, humans use that with rituals. We do a lot of little ritualized things to make things, to break the ice or to whatever like that. But we have a huge set of rituals. But these rituals that we have are designed to evoke a particular feeling, just like music is designed to evoke a particular feeling. Now that you recognize that these particular feelings that are evoked are stored in the mind as sankara or as memories, but they are still not you. That in fact, what we've begun to understand is that human memory is really spotty. It is not a very good memory system. Let me give you a whole bunch of examples of that. On your computer, you probably have some files that have a movie stored in it. Or perhaps you've seen movies downloaded from YouTube. Okay? So think of one of the movies that you've seen recently. Do you know every line in that movie? Do you know every frame that that movie had? Do you know the background of all of the actors and what each one of them said, the voice and play? Well, guess what? Your computer knows all of that. It can play that movie again in entirety and it remembers it wholly. You can see that movie again and you still won't get more than about 1% of it. Isn't that amazing? The human mind is not capable of memorizing things very much, but we do memorize feelings. And so, let me give you another example. Janet Reno. Have you ever heard of Janet Reno? She was the Attorney General under Clinton
Okay.
in the 1990s. While she was Attorney General, a huge scandal broke out in Miami. She was the district attorney in Miami, and she was in charge of an entire bunch of stuff that happened in the 1980s, and it came back to her in the 1990s. What Janet Reno was doing was she had the police and the social workers and a whole bunch of stuff working with young teenage girls to try to get those teenage girls to rat on an uncle or a grandfather or an older teenage boy, and that they got, I think, like, I don't know how many convictions, maybe 50 or 60 convictions out of this. And then later, one of the girls started feeling really bad. I've got an uncle in prison that I put in prison, and I don't quite remember why. And so she started digging into this, and it came out that there were other girls who did the same thing. And what was going on that they traced down was is that these girls were all convinced by the social workers and the police and all of those other peoples that they had in fact been raped, when in fact they had not. And so all of these girls confessed and got all of these guys and put all of them in prison. And now the whole thing, 10 years, 15 years later, falls apart right in front of Janet Reno while she's. All right. So that proved then that those girls did not have those things happen, but they remembered that they happened because they were talked into that they happened. That's the kind of memory that the human mind has. Don't trust memory. But in fact, that's possibly one of the most important qualities of noble right view. When we get into talking about the Eightfold Noble Path, noble right view means don't trust your memory. Investigate. Keep investigating. Don't come to a conclusion because the conclusions might change. And then we're stuck in suffering again because we drew a conclusion that's now false and we're operating under false data, probably feeling bad. So we now have come to understand that my memory systems are not reliable. They're certainly not up to scratch. And therefore, they're not me. Perception, the ability to cognize, the ability to process sensory input to come up with an internal system, is also flawed. We don't process things right. We may get good data in, and we might have good memory, but we still processed it wrong. Partly due to the fact that we might have processed the intellectual part, but we didn't process the feeling part. An example of that would be someone really doesn't like Donald Trump, and so when they see him come, he may offer them something really good. And they can hear that they offered him something really good, but deep in their heart, they already hate him with their feelings so much that they're not going to give him anything. So that would be an example. We can be in a state of feeling such that those feelings, as memories, interfere with the regular part of the processing that should be able to be done. So because we have bodily feelings, bodily sankaras or bodily memories, mental memories, and emotional memories, these things will in fact conflict with each other so that we don't come up with the right mentalization that we would call realize. When I realize something, I realized it wrongly. I perceived it wrongly. I cannot get it rightly. In that regard also, perception, not me. I am not the body. I am not the feelings. I am not consciousness. I am not the processing ability, the perception. I am not the sankara. I am none of those things. That whatever I am as a self comes later based upon feelings that are ignorant that cause grasping and clinging and therefore suffering. And so this is how the five aggregates, we want to understand that these five aggregates are actual things that are in the human body, and none of them are you. That who you are comes and goes. It changes. It's there for a little while, and in fact, it's most likely to be there when we want it or think about it to be there, and then when we're not thinking about it, it goes away completely, but we kind of think that it's there. So the self and consciousness both have a quality to them that is very confusing. So let me give you an example. In the old days, when I say old days, let us say starting from 1860 all the way and especially through the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, up until the time when we had VCRs. Before that, and even after VCRs, it was only recently that we went to full digital, let's say, movie making. But years ago, we used movies in the sense of film. And even now, when we have movies digital, we still have the quality of a frame. We have a short picture, then we have another short picture, then we have another short picture. Okay. So the eye is actually kind of slow. That things can move so fast that we cannot see them. And so what happens in the eye is that it becomes a blur. So what they have done in pictures to show, in movies to show speed is by having a blur. But the important point that I want to make is, first off, my dad was a projectionist when I was 6 years old. And so I went to see the projection equipment, huge, huge machines operated by an arc light. Because they, in order to get it bright. Now, in World War II, they had arc lights, used them a lot in England trying to find the aircraft that Germany was flying over. So they had to be very, very bright. What it is, that it's a carbon rod that is coated with copper to make a good connection. And you'll have an anode and a cathode of high electricity, so when this thing goes and touches, it will start a very, very high, bright arc but that it also burns away the carbon and so you have to have a machine that drives this at a certain speed, and that's the speed that you drive it then will determine the brightness. So that light is on all the time. And so they have a frame that they're going to show you. But then to change the frame in front of these old machines, we're talking about early 1950s, there was a motor that had a fan blade on it, but the fan was such that this quarter was black, this quarter was open, this quarter was black, and this quarter is open. So that as this thing spun around, it was only allowing the light from that arc to hit the screen half the time. The other half of the time when it was black was when the chattering was happening, so that the machine would take and move to the next frame, and then the fan would move and show you that frame, and then it would go black again, and then it would chatter and set the next frame. No one in the audience recognized they were watching a movie for only half the time. They thought the movie was continuous. And in fact, the screen was black half the time. And nobody can see that because the eye is not sharp enough. Now, way back in the early days, say 1910, 20, 30, 40, they actually would go at 10 frames a second. They're actually doing that a lot now recently because the time between the frames can be manipulated. So that if you've got 10 frames a second, you can have one frame on for 9/10 of a second, and then in 1/10 of a second, you can move it and then have the next frame. And that's also very hard. But in the old days, when it was half on and half off, it was very easy to see it flicker. That's why they called them flicks. The movies flicked because you could see the flicker. So when they speeded it up from 10 or 15 frames a second up to 24 frames a second, that's when the flicker disappeared because the human eye is not capable of seeing those very short changes. This is enormously important because that's happening to you all the time. And in fact, if you recognize that if I see this and then I process it, I have missed the next thing that happened. That's partly the reason is because people are trying to make sense out of these films. But if you just walk in and just sort of half gaze at it without any thought about what it's presenting or anything like that, so we don't process it, you can begin to see the flickers again. That is, in fact, the reason that we cannot see that flickering is because we're doing perception. The perception is now preventing us from being conscious of what's happening. So we go from consciousness to perception, and that perception time is very much like that wheel on the projector when it's in the black phase. We're not able to see anything. But in fact, you could think of it, the whole human mind is like that because during that black phase is when we can change to the next frame. We're processing it. Okay, so our processing time gets in the way. So one of the qualities that you'll want to begin to understand with your meditation is let's do some things between the processing, which means let's do less processing and more consciousness. This will take a little bit of effort, and you'll probably see no results, but eventually you'll begin to see results. Oh, yes, I can. I can, in fact, stop being in processing and be more in the here now. Now, also that perception or that processing can actually last quite a long time, especially if we're confused. In other words, if we see something, we process, if we get no answer, we'll just do more processing and more processing, trying to come up with an answer. Because we don't like the confused, I don't know what it is kind of answer. All right. So in that regard, when we are getting bad data, or if we are getting unknown data and we don't know how to process it, we wind up spending a lot of time processing and not a lot of time actually looking. So this is part of the reason why everything about the Buddha has to do with be here now, means don't be inside processing, come up to see what's actually going on, to come back to the quality of consciousness. But all five of these things, body, feeling, memory systems, consciousness, perception, none of those things are you. They're mechanisms. The processing part is most of the frontal cortex. But if that frontal cortex is influenced by feelings, then it's not going to get good processing. But if we know how we feel, then we can process things much better. And so this is what Paticca Samuppada and the Five Aggregates are all about, is to give the student a roadmap so that they can see how the mind works in an intellectual way. And then as you're sitting there in your meditation, you can begin to put two and two together. Oh, I see that. I can see that I'm making an internal representation. Ah, that's what rises feelings. I have feelings based upon my internal representation that's already gone through processing, and it was processed through a set of memory systems that weren't up to scratch, and I did it with a processor who also is under fluence and not up to scratch. That means that we need to do things over and over again to get a better understanding of things. This is one's right noble view, is to keep investigating, to keep looking, to keep examining. This is one's right view. That's how. So now I've given you a really good understanding of how the five aggregates and the Paticca Samuppada fit in together. The aggregates are those physical things that actually do exist. Consciousness actually does exist. The body actually does exist. The feelings exist. Our memory systems actually exist. Our perception or our ability to process exist. But none of that is me. That what I am is after the processing is done and the feelings arise. And once the feelings arise, then the ignorance of, I like it, therefore I want it. That's when the I comes in play. So by looking at it in the sense of consciousness from that thing with the film playing a movie, the same thing is true with me. The I is also intermittent. Sometimes it's on and sometimes it's off, but we have the illusion, like in the illusion of the movie, that we're seeing the movie all the time when in fact the screen is black half the time. The self is also like that we think there's a self there when in fact much of the time there's no self there at all. Because self is defined through feelings. If we're having no particular feeling, then we're having no particular self. Isn't that amazing? Because that illusion of the self-preservation instinct gives us the idea that the self is there all the time and needs to be protected all the time. Oh no, the self comes and goes all on its own. It doesn't need protecting because it's going to be dead within a second or two anyway.
How do you avoid getting into like nihilism though? Like, there is no self, nothing matters, stuff like that.
Well, the reality is that nothing does matter until it matters to someone or something. But on its own, every tree is empty. The only thing that's there is treeness, but it's not got a self to it, a house. And in fact, one of the big issues about with America, and I think this is general in the West, is the idea of a haunted house, which means that there is a self of some description in that house, and it is the house. So the house itself becomes haunted. Look how many thousands of movies have been done on with that kind of theme. Uh, but that the self it comes and goes, but we have the belief system or the delusion that it is permanent. That in fact, um, most religions, um, that's a foundational issue. Because if, for instance, if Christianity taught, oh, there's no self, there's no soul, then they have no promise of heaven. I can make my own damn heaven, thank you very much, Mr. Preacher Man. And so they say, oh no, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. You are not good. Only God is good. You need Jesus as your Savior, and He's going to save what? He's going to save you from your sins by saving a soul. But if I've got no soul to save, then guess what? I'm free from the rites, rules, and rituals of Christianity. And so Christianity or all of the other religions have a lot of investment in wanting people to believe that there is a self or a soul there. Hindus have it with the concept of karma and the karma machine, with the idea that if you do a good deed now, then if you do not get rewarded for that good deed now, eventually the karma machine will remember you so that centuries from now he can give you the benefit of your good deed now. Which means there's got to be connection between that guy in the future and me now, and that connection is the soul. I'm the same dude. But if you look at it from physics point of view, a soul requires something that normal people don't really understand. They think a soul is a soul, but what the major quality of a soul, if there is one, is identification. In other words, my soul is not the same as your soul. Imagine that you and I were in a car together and we have an accident and we both die. How's the karma machine, or God for that matter, going to determine who's who? Well, they have to be able to determine who's who because the souls then must be somehow unique. Never mind you and I in a car, how about a whole busload of people go over a cliff? And now how is God or the karma machine going to straighten that mess out? Or how about Nagasaki or Hiroshima? What are you going to do when you got 100,000 people die in the same second? How are you going to sort that mess out, Mr. Karma Machine? The answer is that every soul has to be unique, identifiable. Well, if you know, and by the way, this part of my lectures, my computer scientist friends, they really love this part of it. But for you, it might be a bit boring. So let's say that you had a telephone number or a social security number that identifies who you are. Well, they don't have, the social security number doesn't have enough digits in it. They have to keep retiring and reusing social security numbers because they don't have enough of them. The digits not long enough. Telephone numbers are not large enough. So we have to have area codes, and then we have to have country codes and all of that kind of stuff to get some uniqueness for telephone numbers. Now, imagine not only with Christians being correct that all 7 billion humans have to have an identification. Within the Buddhist or the Hindu context, oh no, it's the worms and it's the birds, and now we got really way up there. We got a huge collection. Which means now the soul has to have a great deal of precision for uniqueness. And yet, we also understand that down at the level of particle physics, that there are no levels of particle physics where the particles themselves are permanent. Nothing is permanent. An example of that is that water can be broken into hydrogen and oxygen. When the oxygen breaks off, when it takes electrons, did it take one of the electrons from the original hydrogen and leave one of the electrons Or did it get the original one? The answer is we don't have any way of knowing because electrons only have four primary properties, and therefore, once an electron gets into a valence, we can't determine where, not only we can't determine which one it is, we can't even determine where it is. So at the level of particle physics, things are too simple and they still break down, which means that let's go up to the biological level and look at DNA. Well, DNA would be complicated enough so that the soul could exist with that kind of complexity, and yet DNA is not permanent either. Nothing is permanent. How can that DNA, you bury the guy, and then they're going to dig him up 300 years from now and put him back to life? Sorry, the worms ate it. All you've got now is worm DNA. You do not have any human DNA anymore. It's temporary. When we recognize at the level that everything that could be incorporated into a soul is temporary, there is no possibility for such a thing as a soul to exist. Now, in the old days, we didn't really understand physics enough to where we say, oh, well, maybe there's still room for something like a soul, and we can still have particle physics and biological cells and DNA and all of that, but a soul can be something else. But now that we have fully understood physics in the sense that there are only four primary ways for energy to exist, there are only four forces: the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, electromagnetic force, and gravitational force. No other forces are there. There are no forces in the universe that can manage to keep a soul together. It's going to fall apart. Everything falls apart, even with the even with the four primary forces of physics. Nothing is strong enough within those four forces of physics to keep anything permanent. Everything is temporary. Everything is temporary. No room for a soul. But I want to tell you something. That is not a disaster. That's liberating. Think about it like this. If there is no soul, then there is no football or soul for God to kick around. He does not have any control over you at all. You are completely free from everything that the Christians ever taught you about God. He's got absolutely no power. Nothing. Nada. Why? Because all of God's power is over a soul, and the soul doesn't exist. But let's take that one step further by looking at it from the position of the atheist. The atheist is very close to Christianity. Both of them believe in a soul. But for the atheist, the soul dies upon the breakup of the body. For the Christian, the breakup of the body does not break up the soul. Now, within Buddhist context, that means that atheists and Christians are very, very similar, because both of them believe in a soul or a self that is going to die at the end of the break up the body. But by close inspection, we realize that not even that kind of soul exists. And with the atheist, they too are still suffering in the sense of there being a football, but now the God that football controls is the the God of society, the God of that instinct, the nesting instinct. Also, the soul of the atheist is controlled by his views about who he identifies with. My soul is a Catholic soul. No, wait a minute. This is an atheist. A Democrat. But the atheist, when he comes to understand Buddhism, he also understands not only do I not have the soul that the Christian God can kick around, I don't even have a self that the atheist God can kick around. I am completely free. This is what real freedom is about, is to understand there is no soul, there is no self. You are not subject to any laws, rules, regulations, or anything like that. And in fact, there is only one force that you and I need to be concerned about, and that is the force of suffering. Suffering and no suffering. And that's the only force that we have to deal with. There was at one time, in fact, in Sutta number 22, where the Buddha was actually um, talking about being accused of teaching atheism in the sense of, at the break of the body, the being is annihilated. Within Buddhism, what we're looking at is it's not that the self that arises temporarily and dies temporarily is actually not even a being, it's a thought. There is no being there, that we're nothing but a mere set of processes. An example, imagine that you were in a chemistry lab and you had access to some pretty heavy-duty acids, perhaps sulfuric, hydrochloric, something really grisly. And that you take just in a lark, a piece of your sandwich for lunch, and you drop it into this beaker of sulfuric acid. What's going to happen?
I don't know, dissolve.
Yeah, but what happened? What do you mean by the word dissolve? It's going to bubble, and it's going to fizz, and it's going to hiss, and it's going to release all kinds of really strange little droplets of water, some of which you can smell very badly as the because not only is the sandwich being eaten by the sulfuric acid, the sandwich is also eating the sulfuric acid, and in that regard, actual sulfur gas is released, and that's what you can smell. Now, here's the point. The sulfuric acid does not have a self. The sandwich does not have a self. This is merely a chemical process. The human body is nothing but, let us say, very small beakers, perhaps 1 trillion little beakers of acid. And that we keep dropping little sandwiches in there from the bloodstream. And so we're nothing but a fizzing, hissing pile of chemical reactions. And that's all the human being is. There's no being in there. So we can't even call it a human being anymore. It's just a human. Or a better way of saying a human process. And we're constantly in a state of turmoil, a constant state of process. Nothing stays the same. Everything is floating around, and that in fact the human being is nothing but, again, not a being, just a human. But making that mistake, the human being is not really a being, it's merely a process. And when we understand that, that gives us an enormous amount of freedom. And one of the freedoms it has is that we have the ability to change. You see, Christians are taught that they can't change. Look how much of our language is associated with that, in the sense that the tiger cannot change his spots. The fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. Boys will be boys. She's just being Kathy. You hear all of this stuff about justifications of why it's okay for people to be and act badly rather than taking responsibility for those actions and making changes. Because, in fact, Kathy, boys will not be boys. Sometimes those boys will, in fact, grow up to be Buddhas. Because there was a change made. And we have the ability to change. That's one of the liberating qualities of anicca. In the beginning, when people find out about anicca, it's a bit depressing. They'll say, oh, yuck, everything is going to, what good does it do me to make that thing when it's going to fall apart? The answer is that if everything is changing, then everything that I don't like can be changed. Especially in the sense of the liking and not liking can be changed. So everything that I don't like, I can merely change the way that I feel, and then I like them. We can change the way that we're feeling. Let that sink in. You are not a self that is, um, now, it may be a little bit slow and difficult to change some of these old bad habits, but you can. You can. You are a winner. You're a lion. You have been told to be a victim your whole life. Who tells you to be a victim? Well, one, your instincts tell you to be a victim. Number two, being a little small child where when you hold hands, you're holding hands above your head, that's being a victim. Being having to have your own clothes changed because you can't change your own clothes, that's being a victim. Being fed, that's being a victim. So we all as children start off as a victim, and then all of our parents are going to make sure when we get into teenage years, we're still a victim. And the whole society is a society of victims. Why? Because something happens on the outside that affects me and I have no control over it. But now that we recognize, oh no, we're our own change agents, something happens on the outside and I still have control over how I'm going to feel about it. How can I have control over how I feel? Is because I know how I feel. If I don't know how I feel, then I can't control them. So the whole idea is to understand these five aggregates and how the five aggregates themselves, through perception, manufacture a feeling, and if that feeling is ignorant, then we're bound to suffer. If that feeling is wise, then we have a chance to change our feelings. So let me give you a clear example of that. My daughter, we cured her of it, but at one time she was throwing tantrums. When she would throw a tantrum, and every kid that throws a tantrum, when the kid throws a tantrum, nobody likes it. If the kid throws a tantrum in the grocery store, then mom will buy that child whatever he's throwing a tantrum on just to get the kid to shut up, right? We give in to the kids, but we don't like it. So we often, because we don't like the child throwing a tantrum, we'll get angry at the child. The child will still be defiant or whatever. And so we wind up punishing the child, hitting the child, etc., like that. And that perpetuates that whole rigmarole. But if I am wise, when I see the girl, the child behaving that way, and I can see how I feel about it, I can choose how I'm going to feel. And if I can choose the way that I feel instead of not liking her, I can choose to feel joyful, happy. And now I can treat her that way, and I can actually change her behavior by being joyful. You see, normally what will happen when a child is throwing a tantrum, the adult throws a tantrum too, teaching the child again that it's okay to have a tantrum. After all, there's my example. Mommy's having a tantrum. She's beating the tar out of me. But if the old master can come to the child and say, looks like you're having a tantrum right now. How does that feel? Does it feel good to be in a tantrum? And you start connecting with the child like this, then the next thing we can go is we can go to the point of making fun of the child. Ha ha, you're having a tantrum, da 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 da, look at Kitty cry. And she'll storm off and slam the door. But now it will start to change. So this is exactly how feelings, if you can become aware of your feelings, your whole life can be changed the way you want it to be by learning how to understand how you feel. Because you are not those feelings. They come up, and if they come up in a way where you can see them, then you can choose. Only then are you the boss of your feelings, is after you're completely capable of seeing them. So a lot of what we've been doing with meditation is to get you up to the point where you can start watching feelings. And where we do that, why we do it that way, is by watching the body. because so many of the feelings that we have will arise from the senses of the body, not necessarily from the eyes or the ears. For the meditator, it's normally the body sensations that we associate with scratching, itching. Um, it's winter time. You have to wear heavy clothes. The clothes are pressed down upon you, and so they become itchy, etc., like that. And we don't like those feelings. But normally, what will happen is that those slight unpleasant feelings that happen with the body, they go up, they connect into the spinal cord and go right up into the brain. But the part of the brain where the body is connected to is the anterior cortex, the reptilian part of the brain, which is exactly the same part of the brain where feelings arise, the old reptilian part of the brain. Well, guess what? Your hands, the one who does the scratching, is also connected to the reptilian brain through the body. So it is quite possible for a sensation to occur on the body, and the reptilian brain registers that sensation as I don't like it, and then orders the hand to go scratch it, while the frontal cortex part of the mind is off having a conversation. And you can see that often. That's one of the reasons why I watch for body movement with my students. And I don't see a lot of body movement with you, but some of the students are doing this, you know, putting their hands on their face. So that's one of the qualities to begin to watch is don't touch your face with your hands. Or, but we know that from childhood. Our mothers taught us that. And some people learned it and others don't. So that's a bit of mindfulness to not touch your face with your hands in polite society. But now we recognize as meditators, oh, that's actually quite valuable as a teaching to start becoming aware of what our hands are doing so that we don't scratch. We don't allow that reptilian part of the brain to control the hands, that if we're going to move the hands, we're going to do it consciously, even if we're scratching, that we don't let it happen automatically. So we start to take control over our hands, and by doing so, we're recognizing that already we're beginning to take control of the feelings. The reason that the hands move the way they do is because we're ignorantly, the hands are ignorantly under the service of the reptilian part of the brain. And so if we can begin to see the body as the movements of the body that are done semi-automatically or subconsciously can be brought fully into conscious awareness, can be done by slowing things down, for instance. Of the several bodily sensations that I have now, one of them is right here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to rub it or take care of it handily. The mind really wants to scratch it. And so I'm actually going to do the scratching, but I'm going to do it completely consciously. And then I can put my hands back in folded position and allow them to stay that way. So this is one of the qualities that I wanted to introduce to you, is to start watching what your hands are doing throughout the day, to notice where they are, to notice when you pick things up, to notice when you're scratching or applying makeup or doing any of the other things like that. And by the way, on the side, just as a side note, I want to congratulate you for not wearing a lot of makeup. That's especially amazing that you're in New York. I would expect you to have eyelashes at least 3 inches long.
No, I'm too lazy for all that stuff. Too much trouble.
Yes, it is. It really is a lot of trouble. But let us, without putting a gender on it, on the word dude, we'll just say that good Dhamma dudes don't wear makeup, not much, only because of a particular situation that would require it. But if you'll notice, many women in America wear makeup all the time because they're identified with the body. I am the body, therefore. And by the way, when they identify with the body, they identify with a body that's not quite as beautiful as it ought to be. So let me go buy some stuff from Max Factor to help that out. So in fact, to wear makeup is a victim. A lion does not need to wear makeup. She's good enough. Everything is good enough, sufficient, satisfactory. Therefore, we don't need to go do things to make things better, that are good enough as they are right now. So, along with the assignment of the generosity, the new assignment is going to be to start watching your body, to start watching your hands, especially to catch yourself with your hands doing things that you would almost call involuntary, because it's coming from the part of the brain that we don't have full conscious control over. It's from the amygdala, the medulla oblongata, the cerebellum, all of that kind of stuff that's in the down into the penile, which is deep inside like that. But all of that stuff is in the back part of the brain. And in fact, if you look at drawings and line drawings of the brain or whatever like that, they almost always paint the anterior cortex in a different color. And if you look at it, you can see that the brain of the human being that is our anterior cortex is shaped like the brain of a snake, or the brain of an alligator, or the brain of a lizard. And in fact, some of my students call it the lizard brain, because it's back there. There's a lizard brain in the back of all of us, and if we are fully human, we do all of our processing with the frontal cortex, the human part of the brain. But when we go on automatic pilot or back to subconscious behavior, then that means that it all goes back to the anterior cortex. Now, that anterior cortex is quite remarkable in the sense that if you look at an alligator, they can walk, they can shake their tail, they have eyes, they have ears, they can operate their mouth, they can beat their heart, they can digest their food, they can do 100% of everything that alligators can do, which means that everything that an alligator can do, we can do with the same part of the brain that the alligator uses. That's amazing that our hands and the way that we see all of our sensory input, and there's some exceptions to that, go directly into the reptilian brain. The human part of us comes from this part. If you look at a dog or a monkey or anything, from their eyebrows, it goes straight back. It's like this part of the brain, this part here, just doesn't exist. It does on humans, and so what that means is that the problem is with the humans because they don't use that part of the brain. They because of all of the history behind it and everything, we let the anterior part of the brain do almost all of our living for us. So what it means then to become more human means to become less reptilian, less automatic, less instinctual, and more wisdom-based. So as these feelings arise, if the frontal cortex is aware of those feelings, then we can begin to make some changes to them. But if they just arise and go into operation, then it's too late. And when I say in operation, it means I like it, goes to I want it. I want it means I got to have it. And now we're in full-blown tanha, upadana, one of the four modes of clinging that come from these four instincts. And the Buddha knew all about this stuff. And the neuroscientists are now just beginning to figure this stuff out. And I congratulate them heartily. But what they need to do, though, is to get out of their research papers and out of their MRIs and sit down and start watching their own mind, I think neuroscience would make a great leap forward if the neuroscientists would study their own mind rather than somebody else's. So, neuroscience is catching up with the Buddha. And that's wonderful because that could mean eventually the liberation of the entire human race so that we could get along together. We could truly eliminate war simply because nobody wants it. Now we have to eliminate war when at least 2/3 of the people, 1/3 want to kill the other third. So, humans are not as evolved as we want to be. We're not up to the level that we want to be. We have overinflated ideas of who we are. And one of the overinflations is that I am a self. But the more you begin to understand the real nature of the human being, the lower on its scale of expectation it becomes. That we really are apes. We really are. We're nothing but apes without hair. That's about all we've come to. That our civilization does not eliminate suffering. Our civilization for humans is broken. It's a broken civilization. It does not meet its goals, which means that you as an individual have to realize that that you're a victim of a broken system, and that it's your job is to come out of your victimhood and learn to control that broken system and your own behavior so that you can live a life of joy, peace, and happiness. You can do that. You can change that. That's the important point, is that you are capable of coming out of victimhood into becoming a lion. Because you can change. You are not stuck. You are not a soul or a self that was designed by God for God's pleasure. That you are not that. You can change. That soul is not permanent. It's a process. I know a lot of people would rather be a God's football than a billion collectors of a billion beakers of acid. A billion beakers of acid. That's that's all I am. And so when we can see it like that, we can actually then begin to see and begin to give humanity a break. So long as we have a very high idea of humanity, then we hold humanity to high standards and we're constantly being disappointed. But humans are in fact not capable of meeting the standards that we have. Everyone suffers. When you see someone angry, they're not really angry, and that's all there is. Underneath that is suffering. They're hurting. And as we can begin to see that, and that's what you, by being generous and giving a quarter here and there, you're beginning to get in touch with the suffering that you see around you. That New York is a pit of suffering. It's almost like a black hole of suffering. Huge number, 20 million people all come to the same place, all to suffer together. And so they wind up with enormous amounts of suffering. That if you would take yourself and let us say, go stay on the Appalachian Trail or move to a shack in Colorado or something like that, you'd have far less influence from the suffering of the people around you. Living in New York, well, you're a better man than I, Gunga Din. I don't think I could take it. A lot of suffering. So that's part of what we begin to do, is begin to see the suffering everywhere, that the motivations of people are suffering. And so they're motivated by their suffering. They're motivated by their ignorance. They don't recognize that they're suffering. Or they don't understand the source of the suffering. That's why we always blame someone on the outside. And when we blame someone on the outside for our suffering, we put ourselves in the victim position. I'm a victim of that. But a lion is not a victim. A lion is one who knows how to handle suffering. And so that's part of what your education, your Buddhist education is going to be about, is to understand the nature of suffering everywhere. And I'll give you some more assignments, but right now I want to give you the assignment of beginning to watch your hands. Notice how your hands reflect your suffering.
I carry a lot of tension in my hands. First time I noticed it during the Goenka retreat. I felt like, you know, that syndrome when you work on the keyboard too much. I felt that during the retreat, and I thought, oh, that's strange. You know, normally I don't get that type of tension during my regular life. Why is it coming up on the retreat? But now I paid more attention when my hands are tense, and that's very interesting to observe why it happens or in what situations, and how it is most of the time is there, you know. It's additional tension.
Well, I think what you're mentioning is carpal tunnel syndrome.
Right.
Okay. Actually, it goes from, they have two words, chronic, and chronic means that it's flaring up right now, and that you can experience that when you're actually typing. But what you were experiencing in the Goenka retreat was the residual from that. No, wait a minute, I got them backwards. Acute means that it's a really big deal right now, but chronic. So you were actually experiencing in the retreat the residue of that chronic or long lasting, but you're not aware of it. But now you get into the meditation retreat and you're beginning to open your awareness. You can actually begin to see, oh, that stuff is here now too, just in a very different, more subtle way. So that's a very good thing. That's actually good awareness. So beginning to notice how you use your hands, especially on the keyboard, by, oh, I don't know, maybe folding a piece of cloth to raise. That's one of the things they say is by raising that area of the arm, it helps eliminate a lot of that tension. So if that's the case for you, then that means that looking and watching your hands in general is a really, really good idea. If there's any tension there, how can you relax that tension? If the hands are moving, if they're scratching the body or adjusting the hair or whatever like that, become aware of it so that all your hand gestures become conscious. And one of the ways of doing that is by slowing it down. Now, next time when you call, I'm going to give you an additional thing. But in the beginning, what I'm going to say is don't try to do it all the time, but do it well whenever you can remember to do it. Whenever you can remember to do it, that's when you start watching your hands, looking at your hands, seeing how you use your hands, notice what their favorite postures are, etc., like that. And when you're reaching for something, begin to reach slowly. Change the way that your hands are in operation. As a side example, there's a major difference between the way that a normal person moves their body and the way a practiced dancer moves her body.
I was just thinking that. I was going to tell you, when I notice the tension, I kind of play this game that I'm either playing the piano, and you know, when you learn to play the piano, you do it very softly, or that I'm dancing and then it becomes very relaxed and smooth and it is
Yes,
such.
okay, exactly. So what you want to start thinking about is dancing, the maneuvers of dancing. So an example of the normal way is I would just grab it. I've got it. But now what we're going to do, let me find something here. I'll use this object.
Something to dance with.
Right. That this is going to be picked up. That what I'm going to do to pick this up with this hand is when I'm moving it, I'm going to open the hand long before I get to it. Just as if. Now, another way of thinking, I'm going to use the word dancer with you, but with another student, I use the word the way that Dracula would approach a sleeping beauty with his hands like this. So this is the way you want to open your hand and get it fully expressed. When you first touch the object, notice which part of your hand first touches the object, and then as you grasp the object, really feel it in your hand. Similar, when you set something down, set it down in a way so that you feel all the object, and then you notice what's the last thing that you do to touch it, because you're going to do this slowly so that you choose some place that's the last thing that you touch it, and then you open your hand to withdraw it, becoming very artistic, but
I like
also
that.
very alert.
Right.
This is actually in suttas, to become aware of reaching, grasping, noticing how the hands are used. So you become much more aware and acute with the body. You live in the body. Every American lives in their body, and they pay very little attention to it. So now we're going to start, because we've been paying a lot of attention to the body during the sitting meditation. Now we're going to start paying attention to the body throughout the day, starting first with the hands and also with the breath. Whenever you can remember the breath, take a deep breath, come back and be here now. As you grasp and reach, watch, do slowly, operate with your hands consciously. Bring everything that you can of the movements of the body into conscious awareness, because otherwise the reptilian part of the brain will go back and do everything on automatic pilot. Now, by the way, that automatic pilot can also be trained. What do I mean by that? Well, a musician will be training part of the reptilian part of the mind and his body in order to play music. The same thing is true for athletics or anything else like that. So basically what we're saying is that we have these various parts of the mind. We have language, we have motor movements and memories, and we have feeling. These are the three things, the three sankaras that make up all of the past that we have, and that we're going now to start to play with these things, to manipulate them, to piddle with them, to break up the old patterns, so that you're much more familiar with your hands because you're paying more attention to them now. You're watching what they're doing now. You're not letting the automatic pilot do so much. We're going to start taking control with the mind.
Nice.
All right. So as a review, we've got the five aggregates, and the five aggregates is what leads us into feelings, and it's the feelings that ignorantly lead to suffering because of the delusion that there is a self there, when in fact there is no self, not a permanent self. It arises and it passes away. You could almost go so far as to say that the self arises for one purpose only, and that is to be the receiver of the suffering. No self, no suffering. So without a self, that means that now what we have is a body, mind, feeling complex that needs to be studied and investigated. And so in the beginning, we do everything we can do on the sitting cushion, but eventually we start taking it off the cushion and start bringing it into our daily life. Hence, the first thing we did was the quarters. Now it's the hands. And eventually we'll do nothing. But right now you ain't seen nothing yet. And naturally I'm making a joke about the Pali word sunyata. Everything is empty. And you, by the way, to finish this off now, you talked about meaning in life. You have always made your own meaning. But we are taught somehow in society that things have a higher meaning or an ultimate meaning, but that means that your freedom has been robbed of you, that you can't make your own meaning. You've got to take somebody else's meaning. But the reality of the situation is that you make your own meaning. Your life has no meaning at all other than what you want it to be. And you have that control. With Dhamma dudes, almost to the man, what happens is that we make Dhamma our purpose in life. That's my purpose. That's my meaning in life. My meaning in life is to be free from suffering. My purpose in life is to spread the Dhamma so that others can be free from suffering. And so that would be a purpose or a meaning in life, which is completely different than the kind of meaning or purpose that we have when we've got a God who creates and maintains the purposes and the meanings. You can make your own purpose. You can make your own meaning. Because the self is not subject to the kinds of things that we've been taught. Because there is no let us say no permanent self on the inside, then that means that everything that is addressing that has really no effect upon you. Religion has no effect upon you. Only you do that. The police have no effect upon you. Only you have effect. The way you treat the police will determine how they treat you. And a lot of people don't understand that. So I'll leave that with you. You go find your own purpose. You go find your own meaning. Because you're very good at doing that kind of stuff, I'm sure. But the main thing about these five aggregates is that there is no permanent self anywhere in there. The body, not you. The feelings, not you. Consciousness certainly is not you. Consciousness is very fleeting. It arises and passes away. It arises and immediately drops into perception. So consciousness is not you. Perception, not you. Feelings, not you. You are not any of those things. And therefore you are free from the vagaries that you thought that you had. The slings and arrows of outrageous fortune don't affect you. And as you gain skill, you can literally pluck those arrows and rocks that are slung. You can grab them right out of the air because you're quick enough to see that stuff. You can pick that stuff right up. An example is that if your husband yells at you, normally when he yells at you, you feel bad. But now when he yells at you, you can see those bad feelings and you say, wait a minute, I don't have to feel like that. He doesn't know anything about me at all. Let me go tickle his nose and see what he does.
He does not yell.
Well, it takes an investigation. And you can find a way of bringing him out of his anger without getting angry at him. Normally we get angry back because after all, that's what he wants. If he gets angry at you, he wants you to be angry at him. You're going to completely confuse him if you don't get angry when he wants you to be angry. But you got to be quick to see those feelings because, in fact, the feeling, I don't like what he's doing right now, very quickly deteriorates into I want him to stop. So if you can catch it at, I just don't like it, before you want him to stop, now you can actually do something about those feelings. An example would be if you find yourself answering him, then the very first thing in anger, if you're in anger and you're talking, the very first thing we want to do is shut up, shut the mouth, stop talking. Let's take this back on the inside and reprocess it. Let's see if we can find any joy in here before I speak again. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but right now we're just getting into the very basics of it. So start watching your hands and begin to start watching how you feel. All of these things are very much associated with the body. Okay?
Okay. Sounds
All right,
great.
you have any last questions?
No, I'll save them for the next time.
All righty. Well, go have fun with your husband.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day, and I think I'll call next week. Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you how my practices are going.
Excellent. Excellent.
Thank you so much.
All righty.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Till next time.
bye-bye.
Thank you.